It was supposed to be the kind of dinner where fortunes are sealed. An exclusive restaurant, a table worth thousands, and a billionaire desperate to impress foreign investors. But as the glasses clinked and deals hovered in the air, something unexpected shattered the illusion of control, the sound of a baby's relentless cries. For nearly an hour, nothing could silence her. Not the toys, not the bottles, not even the frantic hands of professionals brought in at the last minute. The investors grew restless, the billionaire's patience snapped, and the evening spiraled toward disaster. And then, from the corner of the room, someone no one expected stepped forward. A waitress's young daughter. What happened next silenced the entire restaurant and set in motion a chain of events that would destroy an empire. The evening began at Harbor Lights, a restaurant known for its glittering skyline views and tables that cost more than some families earned in a month. For most guests, stepping inside was an occasion reserved for anniversaries, milestones, or victories. But for billionaire Jonathan Croswell, CEO of Croswell Global, it was just another line on his calendar, another performance in a life of power. That night, Jonathan wasn't here for pleasure. He was here to secure a €70 million deal with European investors, the kind of agreement that could cement his company's expansion overseas. His suit was pressed to perfection. His watch gleamed under the chandelier light, and his every gesture radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to bending situations and people to his will. But alongside him sat an element he had not planned for. His 7-month-old daughter, Sophia. Normally, such a high-stakes dinner would have meant leaving her in the care of one of his trusted assistants or nannies. But fate, inconvenient as ever, had intervened. His assistant had cancelled at the last moment, and with no other options, Jonathan had been forced to bring his infant daughter to the most important meeting of his year. First, it seemed manageable. Sophia, wrapped in a blanket embroidered with her initials, sat quietly in her seat. Jonathan even allowed himself to imagine that her presence might soften his image in front of the investors, projecting a rare humanity from a man often criticized as cold. But babies are unpredictable, and wealth offers no immunity against the storms of childhood. As the first course arrived, Sophia began to cry. It started softly, a small whimper easily ignored among the clinking of cutlery. But within minutes, her cries grew sharper, louder, more insistent. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, bouncing her lightly, offering a bottle. Nothing worked. The sound of her wails sliced through the polished atmosphere of Harbor Lights like broken glass. The investors exchanged subtle glances. Their patience was thinning. These were men who valued efficiency, order, and results, not chaos. Jonathan, usually the embodiment of control, suddenly appeared powerless, fumbling in ways he never did in boardrooms. For nearly 45 agonizing minutes, Sophia's cries refused to relent. Expensive toys were pulled from an emergency bag, only to be tossed aside. Bottles went untouched. In desperation, Jonathan even called in not one but 2 professional nannies, rushing them into the restaurant. Neither could calm the child. For a man who commanded empires, this small, fragile life proved immovable. And as the clock ticked, the cost of failure grew. Not just the $6,500 price tag of the dinner, but the potential loss of a deal worth millions. His investors were growing restless, their expressions shifting from polite restraint to open irritation. The weight of judgment pressed heavily on him. Watching from the sidelines was Maria Alvarez, a waitress who had worked at Harbor Lights for 8 years. For her, this restaurant wasn't about luxury or spectacle. It was about survival. Every shift meant hours on her feet, serving the wealthy while quietly calculating how much of her paycheck would go to rent, utilities, or groceries. That night, she was moving with her usual grace, balancing trays and timing refills, all while aware of her own child sitting quietly in the corner. Her daughter, Elena, only 13, had accompanied her because their babysitter had fallen sick. While most kids her age might have been fidgeting with a phone or sneaking glances at dessert trays, Elena sat absorbed in a thick book on economics, pages filled with concepts far beyond her years. Maria worried sometimes that her daughter's brilliance was both a gift and a burden. But on nights like this, when she saw Elena lost in thought, she felt a quiet pride. As the chaos of Sophia's cries dragged on, Maria noticed the tension building like a storm cloud over Jonathan's table. She saw the investors shifting in their seats, the billionaire's forced smiles, the restless glances of the staff. And though she knew her place, a Latina waitress in a black uniform, invisible to most of the powerful people she served, something inside her urged her forward. She hesitated, weighing the risk. Approaching a man like Jonathan Croswell could mean humiliation, or worse, the loss of her job. But the sight of the baby, red-faced and desperate, cut through her fear. And the investor's impatience signaled an impending disaster that no amount of money could fix. So Maria took a breath, stepped closer, and offered something unexpected. It was not wealth, not influence, not authority. It was helpful. What came next would silence the room, stun the investors, and set off a chain of events that none of them could have imagined. Because in that upscale dining room, amid crystal glasses and million-dollar contracts, the power to change everything would not come from the billionaire. It would come from a child. The moment Maria spoke up, Jonathan's reaction was sharp. He looked her up and down, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and insult. A billionaire, surrounded by investors and luxury, was being offered help by a waitress in a black uniform. To him, it was almost laughable. But desperation had already shredded his pride, and with a mocking tone, he agreed. If her daughter failed, he sneered, neither of them would ever set foot in Harbor Lights again. Maria's hands trembled as she gestured toward Elena. The room turned, curious and skeptical, as the young girl rose from her corner. She wasn't dressed for an occasion like this. Her sweater was plain, her shoes scuffed, her hair tied back simply. In a world obsessed with appearances, she looked out of place. But her composure stunned the crowd. Calmly, she reached for Sophia. The change was immediate. Elena adjusted the baby's posture with practiced ease, applying gentle pressure to her back as she began humming a soft Spanish lullaby. Within 30 seconds, the impossible happened. The cries that had pierced the restaurant melted into silence. Sophia's face softened, her fists unclenched, and for the first time in almost an hour, she smiled. A hush fell over the room. Investors who had been moments from leaving now leaned forward, impressed. Maria felt her chest tighten with relief and pride. But as she caught Jonathan's gaze, she realized this wasn't gratitude in his eyes. It was something darker. Jonathan's confidence had been restored, but not by his own hand. It was a blow to his ego, a reminder that money and power couldn't buy every solution. And the fact that the answer had come from a 13-year-old Latina girl only deepened the sting. After the investors left that night, Jonathan's mask of civility cracked. Behind closed doors, he filed a complaint with the restaurant's management. By morning, Maria was summoned into the office. She sat frozen as her manager explained Jonathan's demands. Elena was to be banned from the restaurant permanently. If not, Croswell Global would pull its $250,000 annual catering contract. Maria's heart sank. Her daughter had saved the evening, rescued Jonathan from humiliation, and now she was being punished for it. Worse, this wasn't about a baby's cries anymore. This was about power, arrogance, and prejudice. Jonathan couldn't tolerate that a child he dismissed as inferior had succeeded where he failed. Elena, however, didn't crumble. At the library that afternoon, she poured herself into research. Her notebooks filled quickly with lines of data, patterns, and connections. She tracked Croswell Global's history, lawsuits for labor exploitation in Southeast Asia, executives pocketing bonuses while workers were laid off during the pandemic, and tax evasions hidden under layers of shell companies. Her mind, wired for patterns, recognized something chilling. Jonathan wasn't just arrogant, he was predictably arrogant. Every 16 to 18 months, his records showed the same cycle of reckless decisions, each fueled by his belief that he was untouchable. Elena began sketching models in the margins of her economics book, mapping out the flaws in his judgment like equations waiting to be solved. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of Professor Richard Hahn, a retired economist who frequented the same library. Curious about the girl scribbling game theory formulas most graduate students would struggle to grasp, he asked to see her work. What he found stunned him. Elena had outlined a repeating error cycle in Crosswell Global's leadership decisions, backed by data and logic. The professor, both impressed and disturbed, told her, "What you've mapped isn't just numbers. It's a blueprint of how arrogance destroys empires." But Elena wasn't stopping at theories. She had also studied the European investors, Landsberg Holdings. They had a reputation for ethical practices, for walking away from deals that reeked of exploitation. If they knew the truth about Jonathan, they would never sign. That became her mission. Over the following 2 weeks, a storm gathered. A journalist published an exposé on Crosswell Global's exploitation scandals. Former employees flooded professional networks with scathing reviews. Government agencies announced an audit of the exact years Elena had identified in her research. And then came the anonymous dossier. Transcripts and hidden recordings of Jonathan's discriminatory remarks, delivered to the investors themselves. Jonathan dismissed it all. To him, it was a coincidence, noise, irrelevant chatter in the background of his empire. He was untouchable, or so he thought. But Elena had planted the seeds. And as the night of the final dinner approached, the tension reached breaking point. Jonathan, smug and convinced that his charm would overshadow the noise, prepared to meet the European delegation once again at Harbor Lights. He strutted into the restaurant with the same confidence he had always carried, blind to the fact that every move he made was now being watched. Maria worked her shift in silence, bracing herself for the inevitable confrontation. She knew Jonathan wouldn't resist another chance to humiliate her. But this time she wasn't afraid. She had Elena, and Elena had a plan. When the investors arrived, Jonathan greeted them with his trademark smile. But before long, the mask began to slip. His words turned sharper, his arrogance louder. He insulted Maria openly, sneering that people like you should know your place. He mocked Elena as a little girl who thinks she's smarter than me. The investors stayed polite, but their pens scribbled notes. The microphones hidden nearby captured every word. And while Jonathan thought he was controlling the evening, the truth was far more dangerous. The trap was already closing. The night of Jonathan's second dinner at Harbor Lights began with glittering confidence. The chandeliers sparkled, the waiters moved with precision, and the investors from Landsberg Holdings sat poised to discuss final terms. To Jonathan, this was redemption. A chance to erase the embarrassment of the first dinner and reclaim his place as an untouchable titan. But beneath the polished surface, a storm was waiting. From the very start, Jonathan's arrogance seeped through. He spoke loudly, dominating every conversation, his laugh echoing across the dining room like a performance. Yet, for all his practiced charm, he couldn't resist the temptation to wound those he considered beneath him. When Maria quietly placed a dish on the table, Jonathan smirked and announced for all to hear, "People like you should know your place. This is a table for decision-makers, not servers." The words sliced through the air. Maria froze, the tray trembling in her hands. Around her, whispers rose. The investors' faces shifted, polite smiles replaced with tight, uneasy expressions. But Jonathan didn't stop. He turned his attention toward Elena, seated discreetly in the corner with her books. "And as for that little girl," he sneered, "she might trick a baby into silence, but she'll never trick me. She thinks she's smarter than a man who built an empire. She should be at home, not pretending she belongs in rooms like this." The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, calculated to remind everyone of the hierarchy he believed in. To Jonathan, Maria and Elena weren't people. They were props in a world he controlled. What he didn't know was that every word was being recorded. Tiny microphones, planted earlier, captured the venom in his tone. The investors, tipped off by an anonymous note, listened closely, their pens scribbling observations with every insult. They weren't just evaluating a deal. They were witnessing a man reveal his character in real time. And then the breaking point came. Jonathan raised his glass, smug and careless, and mocked Maria once more. "You're lucky this place even lets you wear that uniform. Without people like me, you'd be invisible." The restaurant fell silent. The only sound was the faint clink of crystal as he set his glass down. In that moment, the mask of respectability he had worn for years cracked wide open. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, clips of his tirade surfaced online. Hashtags lit up social media. Hashtag Crosswell exposed. Hashtag power and prejudice. Hashtag voices matter. The videos spread like wildfire, amplified by journalists, activists, and former employees eager to share their own stories of mistreatment. The investors, known for their ethical standards, acted swiftly. Before dessert even reached the table, they excused themselves, their expressions cold and final. By the time Jonathan returned to his penthouse later that night, the news was everywhere. Landsberg Holdings had officially withdrawn. The partnership was dead. And then the final blow landed. His phone rang, the screen flashing with the names of his board members. Expecting reassurance, he answered with his usual bravado. Instead, their voices delivered a sentence he never imagined he would hear. "Jonathan, you're done. Effective immediately, you're terminated as CEO of Crosswell Global." His empire, worth $1.8 billion, collapsed in a matter of hours. Stock prices plummeted, clients pulled contracts, and regulators announced investigations. The same arrogance that had once built his fortune had now turned into the wrecking ball that destroyed it. Meanwhile, Maria stood quietly in the kitchen of Harbor Lights, unaware of the digital storm sweeping across the world. Her only thought was of her daughter, the child who had been belittled, banned, and mocked, yet whose quiet brilliance had set this downfall in motion. And Elena? She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She sat at her desk at the library, reviewing her notebooks, tracing once again the cycle of arrogance she had identified. The equations were no longer just numbers. They were proof that even the most powerful could be undone by their own blindness. What began as the cry of a baby in a restaurant had become a story of global attention, of justice unfolding in the most unexpected of ways. But as the world watched Jonathan fall, a larger question lingered in the air, one that stretched far beyond Harbor Lights, far beyond one man's empire. If a billionaire could be brought down by his own prejudice, what other empires might crumble when the voices of those long ignored finally found a way to be heard? In the weeks that followed Jonathan Crosswell's spectacular downfall, the world shifted in ways no one could have predicted. News outlets dissected every detail of his empire's collapse. Social media swarmed with discussions of power and prejudice, and former employees finally felt free to share stories they had long buried in silence. To many, it was the fall of a billionaire. But to Maria and Elena, it was something more personal, proof that the voices of those dismissed as invisible could echo louder than any boardroom decree. Maria's life began to change in ways she had never dared to imagine. The investors from Landsberg Holdings, who had witnessed Jonathan's cruelty firsthand, reached out privately. They weren't just impressed by Elena's brilliance. They were moved by Maria's dignity in the face of humiliation. Within months, Maria was offered a position far beyond the confines of a restaurant uniform. She became the regional HR director for a new chain of restaurants that prioritized ethics, diversity, and respect, a company built intentionally to be the opposite of what Crosswell Global represented. For the first time, Maria no longer felt like she was simply surviving. She was building, contributing, and shaping workplaces where no one would ever have to endure what she and her daughter had faced. But the most extraordinary transformation belonged to Elena. At just 13 years old, she received a full scholarship to Cambridge University, becoming their youngest admitted student. Professors marveled at her grasp of game theory, economics, and human behavior, fields where she was already writing notes that graduate students struggled to understand. Her models, born from hours spent in a quiet library, were now the foundation for something much larger: algorithms designed to prevent discrimination in hiring and recruitment. Within a year, Elena's system was adopted globally, ensuring that decisions about people's futures were not clouded by prejudice or bias. Companies that had once dismissed voices like hers now relied on the very tools she created to build fairer, more equitable workplaces. Even suppliers linked to Crosswell Global adopted the system, ensuring that Elena's brilliance reshaped the very industries Jonathan had once dominated. And Jonathan, the man who had mocked Maria's uniform, who had sneered at Elena's intelligence, who had built his fortune on arrogance and exploitation, he now lived in a modest apartment, stripped of his empire, scratching out a living as a freelance consultant. His name had become synonymous with disgrace. Clips of his downfall reached more than 15 million views, each replay a reminder that arrogance disguised as power is never as untouchable as it seems. But Elena never framed what happened as revenge. To her, it wasn't about destroying Jonathan. It was about building something so brilliant, so undeniable, that the world had no choice but to listen. Her words, spoken quietly to her mother, carried more weight than any headline. Prejudice is only ignorance pretending to be power. Real intelligence always finds a way to win the equation. That statement resonated far beyond harbor lights. It became a rallying cry, quoted in articles, shared on social platforms, and even echoed in university lecture halls. Because the story of a crying baby, a waitress, and a 13-year-old girl had grown into something larger, a mirror held up to society's most uncomfortable truths. How many times have voices been silenced simply because they didn't come from the right uniform, the right background, the right race? How often have the powerful dismissed those they deemed unworthy, never realizing that brilliance knows no boundaries? Jonathan's empire fell because he couldn't see past his prejudice. But Elena's future soared because she did. And that is the deeper impact of this story. It isn't just about one billionaire's collapse or one child's triumph. It's about the countless moments, across the world, where injustice hides in plain sight, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in restaurants, in everyday interactions. It's about whether we choose to uphold systems built on arrogance or dismantle them with courage, intelligence, and compassion. As viewers, we have to ask ourselves, what role do we play in this equation? Do we stay silent, watching injustice unfold? Or do we recognize that even the smallest voices can shift the balance of power? Because if a 13-year-old girl could topple an empire with nothing but her mind, then what could we accomplish if we truly listened, stood up, and acted together? The lesson is simple yet unshakable. True justice is never about the wealth we hold, but the humanity we refuse to abandon. So I leave you with this question, the one that lingers after Jonathan's empire has crumbled, after Maria has risen, and after Elena has proven what brilliance looks like when it's set free. What would our world look like if every voice, no matter how small or overlooked, was finally heard? What do you think about Maria and Elena's journey? Did Jonathan's downfall feel like justice, or do you believe the real victory was in Elena's rise? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective on this story. And if this powerful journey moved you, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us bring more stories like this to life. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue uncovering untold stories that truly matter.